Hi there, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and lately there's been something on my mind, so I hope you'll join me for a brief rumination on the conversation that never dies: threat assessment. Threat assessment really is one of those topics that just never goes away. Watch any Commander gameplay footage online, and you'll absolutely see dozens upon dozens of comments hyper-scrutinizing the threat assessment on display in that game. Honestly, that's probably the nicest way for me to phrase it. It's YouTube. We all know what the comment section looks like. But right off the bat, that's already one of the most interesting things to me about the threat assessment topic. People on the outside of the game may have an entirely different view than people in the game about who's the biggest threat. A bird's eye view of the game versus having personal stakes in the game are different perspectives. And that is what I'm interested in. How does a different perspective like that change your evaluation of a game's biggest archenemy? There are a couple ways that threat assessment manifests and a couple ways that it evolves, so let's get into it. The first way we understand a big threat is often just the biggest thing in front of us, right? That person has 10 huge creatures in play, or a super scary looking one-shot creature, and it's obvious to everyone that this is a big issue. But as we get better at threat assessment, we also learn to recognize other signifiers of threat level. Did one person just draw tons of cards, granting them all the options they'll ever need? Did they just deploy one of their deck's core engines, which will generate so much advantage that you won't be able to keep up once it's gotten underway? We learn to recognize not just who's a threat now, but who's demonstrating immense potential to become the threat later. Going even further, we learn that our responses to these situations can be flexible. A huge army isn't a problem until it chooses to attack you. We all learn to sandbag our instant speed removal spells until the moment that the huge creature comes our way, because it turns out that creature could have attacked one of our other opponents, and that would be great for us. So we learn not to use our removal on big threats unless we absolutely have to. I think those are some basic principles, but the next level up moment comes as we get better at recognizing that different commanders have different weaknesses to the various threats out there. If you sit down at a table with a Voltron deck, a Life Gain deck, an Aristocrats deck, and an Elf deck, each one of those players will have different worries. It's practically a game of rock, paper, scissors. For instance, the Life Gain player may not be all that worried about the chip damage from Elves or from Blood Artists, because their plan is to gain hundreds of life, so the death triggers and combat stuff would be pretty inconsequential. But they're terrified of the Voltron player, whose ability to deal significant commander damage will punch right through all their life gain. So right off the bat, if the Life Gain deck has any removal, they're probably saving it to use against that Voltron deck. Meanwhile, the Voltron player may not be as worried about the Elvish army, and they know that the life gainer isn't an insurmountable issue, but they might be terrified of Miss Aristocrats over there, because just one Dictate of Erebos or another type of sacrifice effect will take their Voltron deck completely offline. Then, the Elf player might be the most worried about the opponent who's likely to have the greatest number of board wipes that would dismantle their whole army, so they could make a point of first and foremost going after the opponent with the biggest removal-based colors. Or they might try to prioritize the opponent who looks like they'll be able to draw the greatest number of cards, so as to prevent that person from digging down to find their meaningful removal. The point is, if you paused this hypothetical game at some random moment and asked each of these players, who's the biggest threat? I bet you'd get some very different responses, and none of them would necessarily be wrong. And as we become better players, we begin to anticipate those perceptions of threat levels from those other players. If I, as an Aristocrats player, know that the Life Gain deck is saving their removal to use against the Voltron player, that will affect how I politic with both of those players. Or if the Voltron player knows that I need their help to take down that Life Gain player, that person will be better equipped to bargain with me. In this way, knowledge of archetypes and those archetypes' various weaknesses can become instrumental to our success in game. And before we go on, I want to pause and dwell on this stage a bit, because I think it's one of the most important aspects of threat assessment, just period. A while back, I was in a game with some folks, and one of them identified a very scary development that just occurred across the table, and they were fully megaphoning about how big of a threat that was. Like, oh crap, they just played XYZ, we gotta deal with that, that's a huge problem. But then, another player just deadpan looked at him and she said, yeah, for you. Honestly, Queen, legendary, iconic, we stan. That's a huge distinction. There's a difference between is this a threat to everyone and is this a threat to you. The biggest threat is not always some objective thing. It can absolutely be a matter of perspective. If there's something scary on board and no one is helping you deal with it, it might be because they're not scared of it the way that you are. I've absolutely seen players get mega frustrated that no one is helping them deal with the obvious biggest threat. But the reality is, you don't know what's in her hand, or what's in their deck, or what his plan is. And it's certainly not in anyone's best interest to just give away that information now, is it? If you've reached the conclusion that since I'm not dealing with the problem, I must be bad at threat assessment, that seems to me like you're not ready to play around any potential aces that I have up my sleeve. And that's definitely a situation that I'll be able to take advantage of and best you in battle. Like, sure, player A might look scary, but maybe player B has 3 counterspells, and they don't want anyone else to know it. Maybe they have an ink shield ready to make an army of their very own. Or maybe they have some type of insurrection mob rule effect to steal everyone's stuff, so they want the board to be huge. On your end, their behavior might look foolish. Why are they enabling the archenemy? Why aren't they doing something about this? Why are they dealing with smaller issues on board, but not with the big issue on board? But on their end, it makes perfect sense. And here's one of the reasons why this has been on my mind recently. And spoiler alert for a recent Shuffle Up and Play episode I was on. Skip ahead if you don't want to know how the game ends. It's a wildly fun game, definitely check it out. But okay, last chance before spoilers. This was an interaction that happened in the comments of that episode, and it is fascinating to me. This is the kind of snap judgment I'm talking about, an allegation about other people's threat assessment that, frankly, I see all the dang time. Someone so convinced that they understand threat assessment better than everyone else that they fully disengaged with what actually transpired in that game. And again, we all know that YouTube comments are a cesspool, but we've all seen this type of behavior in real life, right? YouTube comments may not be 100% representative of Magic player attitudes out there, but they're not wholly out of the blue either. We've all encountered this kind of thing, and I felt like this discussion would be incomplete without at least demonstrating some type of concrete evidence of the type of behavior I'm talking about. I don't know, y'all. There are some people out there who would rather be good at a game than good to other people, and I just think it's absolute nonsense. Anyway, the point is, judgment about other players' threat assessment is, in my opinion, something that can directly and negatively impact your own threat assessment. If you fail to imagine why other players aren't responding to big threats the same way that you are, you could be missing some really big clues about what's actually going on in that game. Alright, now here's the next level up where things get even thornier. Over time, Magic players familiarize ourselves not just with archetypes, but with specific decks. We disambiguate things as we get more entrenched, and recognize that Sithis, for instance, isn't just an Enchantress deck, she can also be a Storm deck, and that differentiates her from all her peers. We learn that some Will-Help decks out there are pure zombies, while others are full of combos. And we learn to prepare for them, because if we're not prepared and we're caught unawares, it could spell doom for the whole table. We come to learn that if Yidris gets even one single hit in, the value it generates could put that player so far ahead of everyone else that victory is all but secured. We see that a Slimefoot deck played an Altar or a Token Doubler, and we know that their next turn could just be the very end of the game. We discover that some commanders have a small window of opportunity to be stopped, and if they're not stopped right then, the chance of defeating them at all gets vanishingly small. And I think this is where that tension reemerges. Some of these situations are threats to the whole table, not just to one person, right? There are moments like this where the word archenemy is absolutely the correct term, because it is an existential threat to every player at the table. That's the biggest disconnect right there. When someone calls out the biggest threat, or a threat that's about to develop, it does get very muddled about whether or not everyone agrees that yes, that is a threat to everybody, or is it actually just a threat to you? And this is where knowledge of the game can sometimes become a bit of a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, if you don't know some of these combos, or you don't know what these powerful decks are truly capable of, then yeah, it can catch you unawares, and you might not respond to those developing threats in enough time, and thus they wipe everyone out. But on the other hand, and this is where it gets thorny, sometimes having a lot of game knowledge can actually cause players to convince themselves that they know more than they actually do. To try and explain what I mean here, let's say you know a game-winning combo is about to hit the field, and you know you're powerless to stop it. And since you know the decks your opponents are playing too, and you know their colors and what possible options they could have access to, you know when the best window of time would be to stop the nonsense that's going on the field. But your opponents aren't doing that, or they don't have enough mana to do it anyway, so it's clear that, they don't have an answer. So while other folks are still evaluating, wait, what's about to happen? You've already done the math and deduced that it's GG, the game's over. But then, from out of nowhere, someone else pulls out some obscure card that no one saw coming, and they stop the whole thing in its tracks. And in case you think that that example is kind of weird or out there, I'm literally using my own experience here. I was in a game scenario with these exact cards on screen. One person assembled a huge game-winning board, and then another of my opponents said, okay, that's GG, no one helped me deal with the real threat, this is so frustrating, and he scooped. Meanwhile, I had this secret answer the whole time, and I won that game. And you know what his response was? First, he was like, well, why are you playing that? As though, since he didn't anticipate that that could have been an option in that moment, he therefore didn't think that it was a cool card. I don't know, weird response that. But then also he said, well, why didn't you tell me before I scooped? And I'm like, A, you scooped before I could say anything. B, I'm not about to give away a bunch of information to all of the other players. And C, you're not entitled to know about what's in my hand, buddy. Like, what? So again, to reiterate, while lack of knowledge can sometimes cause you to be a bit unprepared for certain decks out there, extensive knowledge can sometimes cause a bit of a Dunning-Kruger effect, where you convince yourself that you know more than you actually know, and therefore you jump to conclusions a little too quickly. Ultimately, I think it's really important to keep in mind that just because you don't happen to have an answer, and just because you can't think of what an answer to this situation might be, that doesn't mean that there's no answer. Now, there's one other thing I mentioned earlier, and that's the matter of watching gameplay versus being in gameplay. And there are absolutely ways where this shift in perspective can also change the way that you evaluate threat assessment. I think we'd expect that a bird's eye view or a top-down view is probably the best or most objective perspective, right? Like when you're up this close to something, you can't really tell what the whole scope of it is, but when you finally get to zoom out, you can be like, oh, okay, cool, I see all the details now. In the same way, being up close in the game can, in some ways, limit your perspective. And real quick, here's an example of this. I tend to play some very conspicuous and obnoxious strategies. Virtus and Gorm or Baba Lysaga are some of my very favorite decks, and they are not my strongest decks, not by any means. But boy oh boy are they attention-grabbing. As soon as you poke one person with Virtus and they lose half their life, the entire table sits up and takes notice. After just 2 activations of Baba Lysaga, where I have 46 life and everyone else has 34, everyone starts looking at those life totals and starts to feel like it'd be really nice to knock that Baba player down a little bit. Now, I know these decks have weaknesses out the wazoo. For instance, Virtus and Gorm are basically a Zeno's paradox. The first cut is big, but it's got vanishingly diminishing returns. A big start that loses steam fast, this deck has a lot of trouble finishing a game, and it really takes some type of wound reflection effect for me to approach lethal at all. And even then, I'm only knocking out one person at a time, unlike tons of other decks out there who have more innocuous starts, but which build towards spectacular finishes that will KO the whole table all at once. But by having something so conspicuous and obnoxious in the command zone, I know that I've added an extra layer to the complexity of threat assessment during that game, because no one wants their life chopped in half. Even if it's true that someone else has a bigger storm brewing on the horizon, I'm the one being a nuisance right now. Even if I'm correct about who's going to be the threat later, the threat that I presented already will affect other people's evaluation of my evaluation. The stakes of being in the game and being the one personally at risk makes people divert their attention towards the attention-grabbing thing. And I suspect that a player with a bird's eye view of the game would be a little more immune to that pull, and would be a little faster to notice someone else at the table who's slowly and quietly assembling their late-game doom machine. However, that doesn't mean that the bird's eye view is always the more objective or the best view of the game. For instance, when you're watching Commander gameplay, it's not always obvious how many cards everyone has in hand. I know I'm better at tracking people's card draw when I'm actually in a game looking directly at them. I feel the weight of them drawing 3 extra cards a turn when I'm over here stuck top decking. Watching gameplay from the top down, I might see one person's battlefield is running rampant, but I might miss that the player with the scariest board over there doesn't have any cards in hand. And therefore, I might not clock that someone else at the table was baiting that player into overextending so that they could take it all down with a well-timed board wipe. From outside of a game, I might ask, why is no one paying for that smothering tithe? But from inside the game, I might be better able to see that that player has 0 cards in hand to spend all that mana on, so the treasures are moot. In fact, I think it's fair to point out once again that watching Commander gameplay not only means you don't always know how many cards people have in hand, but you also don't know which cards anyone has in hand. Like, at least when you're in the game, you know 25% of that hidden information, because you know the spells in your own hand and you know your own capabilities. But a bird's eye view could limit your perspective, so you don't know what anyone is planning. And that could also affect the way you evaluate gameplay as it unfolds. These are all different facets to consider when evaluating the nebulous beast that is Commander Threat Assessment. Different players in a game could each have a different response to the question, who's the biggest threat? People who are in a game might have a different take on threat level than people who are outside of it. And what all of this means is that the number one way to get better at threat assessment is to work on your ability to see the game from those multiple different perspectives. In a word, empathy. Being able to imagine why other people are behaving the way that they're behaving is going to make you better as a player. If someone does something in a game that you don't understand and it looks like the wrong move to you, I wager you'll get a lot farther if you pause and ask yourself, do they know something I don't? And I bet you'll have more fun that way too. So, those are some thoughts that I wanted to get out about threat assessment, but please feel free to continue the conversation down in the comments below. And as always, remember to EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.